Thank you very much, Michael, and welcome, and thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Rather than acknowledge the range of dignitaries here, there's just one I'd like to acknowledge in particular, which is Neil Scales, the Director-General of Transport and Main Roads. Now, Neil is not only probably the hardest working man in Australian transport, serving on a number of different boards, commissions, and obviously heading up the Department of Transport and Main Roads. He's one of the NTC's commissioners, so it's important to acknowledge Neil. So thanks, Neil. Do we have slides? And I'm pleased to be here from a couple of points of view. Firstly, from a professional point of view and also from a personal point of view. Professionally, I'm with the National Transport Commission. And one of the things we do, and our prime role, is writing laws. We administer about 14 different instruments that are generally translated into nationally consistent laws for land transport. The key one of those is the Heavy Vehicle National Law, which regulates all things on the road over 4.5 tonnes. And that includes buses, obviously. And amongst other things, it regulates the size and the mass of buses. And Michael has made me well aware of the issues in the industry around the width of buses of 2.5 and 2.55 metres and the mass of buses. And we're certainly working with Vic and Michael on ways to address some of the concerns of industry. The Heavy Vehicle National Law also regulates work and rest hours and the maintenance which is carried out on heavy vehicles. I'm conscious there are, for bus operators, contracts which also apply additional conditions. One of the other sets of laws we administer are the Australian road rules. Now, they basically govern how people operate on the road reserve. And as much as practicable, they're made nationally consistent. There are obviously some differences in those, like whether you can do a U-turn at a set of lights when signed or not. I mean, it's one of the other differences as opposed to whether you support rugby league or AFL in the terms of the differences between Queenslanders and Victorians. So amongst those rules, we have things like, bus-only lanes, clearances for bridges, signs, need to obey those, and of course bus zones and other things. But it's not just the laws that exist at the moment that we're working on. We're working on a new set of laws to govern automated vehicles. And when we talk about the future of road transport, automated vehicles are definitely coming. Now, one of the things that guides our principle about what is coming is the principle espoused by David Bowie. I mean, he's probably made it the most popular. A number of economists have used the same term, but tomorrow belongs to those who hear it coming. What does the future hold and how do you adjust? Now, David Bowie, as many people would be aware, was a successful musician from the 60s up until the last few years when he passed away. And he attributed his success in part by being able to see not too far into the future, but far enough so he could make minor adjustments to his style so there was still a market currency. So that's what he meant by hearing the future and adjusting to make it successful. Businesses do the same thing, and we in government trying to do the same thing with policy, to hear what's coming and make adjustments so we can accommodate different technology as it gets to the road. But when we look to the future, what does it mean for buses? And the graph here shows two things. For the last 30 to 40 years, total passenger kilometres travelled in capital cities and total bus VKT. And there are two noticeable splotches in the continuous growth of both of those, which has been for 30 years. The first one you'll see is in the early 1990s, when total bus kilometres and passenger numbers flattened out and slightly declined, certainly for passenger numbers. And there was a valid reason for that. For those who remember, 1991 and a few years beyond was a recession we had to have. So the economy was flat, people just weren't travelling. It was a reflection of the broader economy. But if you get to the levelling out in the last few years, from 2011-12, something else is happening. This is not the GFC, it is post that. The economy is actually doing quite well. So there is something else that is playing on the industry that is affecting passenger numbers, and that may well have an implication into the future. And there are people in this room who would know what those forces are far better than I am. We do know that one of the forces that will play a role in the future is automation and automated vehicles, and that's what we're working on. But there are lessons from the past that we can apply to regulating automated vehicles. And when computers, and certainly network computers via the internet, were starting to get great currency in the 1980s and early 1990s, there were a number of studies that looked at network developments and what we could learn from those to apply to computers. And I think we can take the same lessons from those and apply them to vehicle automation. And one study in particular by two economists, Paul David and Julie Bunn, I should say, found one key element. Technology itself doesn't stand in isolation, but as it says there, technology is both society shaping and socially constructed. That is, it enters into a world which is fixed, but then as the technology becomes embraced and used, it starts to change society. And the examples they used were electricity, for example. So prior to electricity, electricity first came into common generation in around about the 1890s. The Expo in Paris in 1887 lit up the Eiffel Tower. The Expo in Melbourne in 1888 had street lights that were used. But it wasn't until 20, 30 years later, 40 years later, that it actually started to change the shape of cities. Changed how factories operated, less belt drives, more motor drives, allowed elevators, etc. So, as I say, it is socially constructed in that it enters society at the beginning, but then it shapes society, and the same will be true of automated vehicles. And there are probably 5 key lessons from those studies that we can also apply. First one is, the far-sighted evangelists always envisage transformation. Doesn't matter whether you're a Henry Ford or a Nikola Tesla or a Thomas Edison, they always imagined big transformations. And for automated vehicles, the most obvious evangelist at the moment is Elon Musk. But transformation didn't occur in these big chunks. It was like with David Bowie, it was evolutionary. It continued over time, incremental changes. And those small incremental changes built on each other so that there was truly revolutionary change, but it happened incrementally. And like evolution, like Darwin's evolution, it wasn't a linear progression. There are get-to-junctures where society looks at it, feels the technology, and the direction it goes changes. And it will be the same for automated vehicles. And one of the things that drove the change is that use expanded as people became immersed in the technology. And this is true of computers. When computers first came out, the head of IBM in the 1950s famously said, there's probably only a market for 5 computers all around the world. Well, how wrong he was. People became immersed in them, they used them, the technology expanded. And the older generation had to adapt, catch up, etc. And then when you get greater use, it leads to standardisation. Standardisation leads to lower cost, which in turn leads to increasing uptake. So there's this spiral or flywheel or logarithmic effect. And when technology takes on, it will go in a logarithmic effect. And we expect the same will be true for automated vehicles as the technology progresses. But finally, and this is the first point, it doesn't matter what was envisaged at the beginning, almost invariably, those who predicted what the future would look like were wrong. So we have to make it an evolutionary, minimal change, a regulatory system that adapts to change. And that's certainly what we're trying to do at the National Transport Commission. We have to develop laws because unlike electricity or telephones or other things that were around at the time, there's a substantial amount of laws that govern the behaviour of people on the road that will need to change. And we identified more than 700 legislative barriers that will have to be adapted, And in addition to that, there's probably dozens, if not hundreds of others that will need to be applied to make sure we can actually get the use of this technology to transfer responsibility from a human, from the people who drive cars, buses, etc., and give it onto something else. As I say, we need to do that because the current laws don't recognise AVs. They recognise that the human is always in control. And we're trying to design laws that ensures appropriate responsibility when a human's not driving. We're also trying to make sure that the decisions on what a vehicle does rest with who is best to make those decisions. So a machine should only make those decisions when it is capable of doing so. So obviously at the moment it's simple environments, but as the technology improves, it might be in more difficult, more complex environments. We have to manage the transition between human and non-human over a journey. And importantly, the last point, we've got to make sure there are incentives in the law that allow the technology to continue to improve. And that's certainly what we're working on. At the moment, within the regulatory system, there are three parties that are by and large regulated in terms of on-road operation. The first is the manufacturer, the OEM, and now there's a whole lot of vehicle standards that set what manufacturers can do. The second party is the owner, so those people who own vehicles, buses, cars, etc., have to make sure their vehicles essentially are fit for purpose, maintained, are safe. So laws around Australia maintain that. And then there are a whole range of rules that apply to the human driver, mostly through the road rules, but also through a range of other acts. So various police acts, acts in relation to, or laws in relation to tolling and charges, stopping at accidents, etc. So things both in the road rules and outside the road rules that will need to change. And we are looking to give that to a new party under the law, which is a fourth party. And this is not something that other parts of the world have looked at until we suggested it. So this is our innovative approach. So introducing a new party called the Automated Driving System Entity that would assume responsibility in part for the manufacturing of the equipment that gets built into the automated vehicle, in part for the responsibility that an owner would have in terms of maintaining the vehicle, making sure, for example, that over-the-air upgrades are applied, making sure that modifications are appropriate for the vehicle, but also, most importantly, having that ADSE take responsibility for the decisions that are currently made by the human driver. And this will be an incredibly complex set of laws, but it's important we get that right for two reasons, and two prime reasons. Firstly is to keep people who go into a road reserve, that's pedestrians, other road users, etc., safe. That is the main reason. The second one is we want to make it flexible enough so that this technology can be used. You know, there are the benefits, and Paul from INIT will talk about the benefits of automated vehicles in the public transport space. There are benefits of using these vehicles, so we're trying to make sure that that benefit, the rules allow that benefit to be used and captured. Now, at the beginning, I spoke about David Bowie when he said, "Tomorrow belongs to those who hear it coming." Well, only a few months ago, the New South Wales Treasurer, Dominic Perrottet, was channeling his inner David Bowie, and he was doing a launch of some grants for their automated vehicle systems in New South Wales. And he said, the future belongs to those who hear it coming. And he also talked about a number of other changes in the transport system that were occurring and had occurred. And one of those was Uber. And there's a salutary lesson in this that we should be aware of in Uber, in that it was only a year or two ago when Uber had significant market penetration, market use, that people said, why didn't we hear it coming? Why didn't we see this coming? Well, the thing is, Uber weren't silent about it. In 2010, they set up in San Francisco. In 2011, they said, we want to expand to a range of cities that have these characteristics. And they had a list of characteristics. And Australian cities had those characteristics. High mobility, high disposable income, people who embrace technology. We had those characteristics, yet we still didn't hear Uber coming. In 2012, before they set up, they issued a media release. We're coming to Australia, media splash, we want to be there. They started taking passengers, and in 2014, so for nearly 2 years, for more than 2 years I should say, they were taking passengers. And then at the end of 2014, after the Lindt Cafe siege, where there was a spike in Uber prices, there was an outcry about Uber, but for 2 years they were operating. Then after that there was a clamp down, there were raids on offices, etc. But within 2 years after that, you saw most states and territories either announce moves to accommodate ride sharing or just turn a blind eye. So the issue is, to hear what is happening, there is a cacophony of noise out there, and companies like Uber are making noise. Automated vehicle manufacturers, and Paul will talk about INIT, about the technology they're developing, are making a noise. It's how you distinguish the noise about the future and what that means and react to it, and distinguish that from the other background noise that is occurring. Thank you.